Have you ever had a dream that felt so real, so possible, yet the world around you refused to believe it? That's exactly what happened to a quiet, determined Norwegian named Thor Heyerdahl in the mid-20th century. Born in 1914, in a small coastal town in Norway, Thor wasn't driven by fame or fortune. He was driven by curiosity, a deep, relentless curiosity about where we come from, how people moved across the globe, and how ancient civilizations may have been far more connected than we give them credit for. While others looked at the world through the eyes of textbooks, Thor looked at it through the lens of nature, myth, and forgotten truths buried in time. In 1937, as a young man, Thor and his wife decided to live among the people of Voyage, a remote island deep in Polynesia, far removed from the noise of the modern world. What began as a simple research expedition turned into something far more meaningful. Living alongside the islanders, Thor observed their customs, their art, their oral histories, and slowly, a startling pattern began to emerge. The style of their carvings, the design of their massive stone statues, even the sun god they worshipped, named Tiki, reminded him of the ancient civilizations of South America, particularly the Inca Empire. He began comparing stories, symbols, and structures, and the more he looked, the more convinced he became. Could it really be a coincidence that the Polynesian god Tiki and the Andean god Virakaka shared such eerie similarities? Could these distant peoples, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, actually be connected? The thought was radical. At the time, historians believed that Polynesia had been settled only from the west by Asian seafarers drifting eastward. But Thor's mind was opening to a different possibility. What if ancient South Americans had sailed across the vast Pacific Ocean and helped populate these islands? He imagined it, strong, sea-wise people building rafts from wood and rope, not knowing where the horizon would take them, but driven by the stars and wind. It wasn't just a theory to Thor, it was a story waiting to be proven. But when he returned home and shared this idea with scholars, he was ridiculed. They said it was impossible. They laughed at the idea that ancient people could cross 8,000 kilometers of open ocean without metal tools, maps, or modern ships. They said the Pacific was too dangerous, the technology too primitive, the idea too absurd. But Thor wasn't the kind of man to back down. Where others saw an impossible gap, he saw a forgotten path. Where others saw empty ocean, he saw a bridge of wind and current. And so he made a choice, one that would go down in history. If the world wouldn't believe his theory, he would put his life on the line to prove it. Not with arguments or essays, but with action. He would build a raft just like the ancients might have done, and he would sail it himself from South America to Polynesia. Thor Heyerdahl's idea wasn't just unconventional, it was revolutionary. At the time, the academic world was firmly rooted in a single belief that the Polynesian islands had been settled by skilled mariners from Southeast Asia, traveling eastward in well-crafted outrigger canoes. It was a theory supported by linguistic links, genetic studies, and decades of research. The Pacific, they claimed, was too vast, too violent, too unpredictable for early civilizations in South America to have sailed across. To even suggest such a thing was to challenge not only geography, but the very fabric of accepted human history. But Thor wasn't convinced by the conventional wisdom. While others saw the Pacific as an impassable barrier, he saw a natural highway, a living, moving system of winds and currents that, if understood, could be navigated even with primitive tools. He pointed to the Humboldt Current, flowing steadily westward from the coast of Peru, and to the trade winds that pushed in the same direction. He studied ancient myths, stone carvings, and agricultural similarities, and everything whispered the same truth. A forgotten chapter in the story of human migration might be hiding beneath the waves. When he tried to share these ideas with the academic elite, the response was swift and cold. Journals rejected his proposals. Scholars dismissed him as naive. Some even laughed outright. But Thor wasn't trying to win their approval. He was chasing a truth he could feel in his bones. And so, rather than argue behind podiums or beg for recognition, he made a bold and almost unthinkable decision. He would prove it himself. Not with theory, but with action. Not on paper, but on the open sea. He would build a raft, not a modern replica or a museum piece, but a true-to-history vessel, constructed only with the materials ancient South Americans would have had at their disposal. No nails, no engines, no steering system, just balsa with logs, tied together with handmade hemp ropes, a sail made of natural fabric, and the raw power of the Pacific Ocean. His raft would not cut through the waves like a ship. It would drift, float, ride the rhythms of the sea, just as he believed the ancient mariners had done long ago. And he gave it a name, Kon-Tiki, in honor of the Incan sun god, a powerful figure who, according to legend, had once ruled from the shores of Peru before disappearing across the ocean. In Thor's mind, it made perfect sense. Maybe, just maybe, the stories of gods sailing west were not just myth, but echoes of real voyages, lost in time. And with that, Thor didn't just begin a physical journey. He ignited a personal crusade to challenge history, defy the experts, and sail straight into the heart of the impossible. As Thor Heyerdahl's dream inched closer to reality, he knew he couldn't take on the Pacific alone. The journey he envisioned wasn't just physically grueling, it was life-threatening. To risk everything, he would need a crew not only brave enough to sail into the unknown, but skilled enough to survive it. One by one, he carefully assembled a small team of men, each bringing something vital to the mission. First was Herman Watzinger, a hydrologist, an expert in water flow, ocean behavior, and survival logistics. He understood the Pacific not just as a body of water, but as a living, breathing force. Then came Eric Hasselberg, a seasoned navigator who could read the stars like a map and guide them without the help of modern instruments. Bengt Danielsson, a Swedish anthropologist, joined as well, fascinated by human migration and eager to test Thor's theory firsthand. To ensure communication, Thor recruited Knut Haugland and Torstein Rabi, to Norwegian war heroes and radio operators who had already faced danger during World War II. They had survived the Nazis. Now they would face the sea. With the crew ready, another mountain loomed: money. The scientific community had already dismissed Thor's theory as nonsense. To them, this wasn't an expedition, it was a slow-motion suicide. Governments refused to sponsor it, universities laughed. Even publishers, who might have been enticed by a daring adventure, turned him away. They didn't believe a story would come out of the voyage unless it was a tragic one. To most, it sounded like a gamble with death, not a journey of discovery. But Thor didn't stop. He knocked on every door, made every call, and pitched his vision to anyone who would listen. Finally, one small publishing house took a leap of faith. They offered to support the expedition on one condition: if the team survived, they would have the exclusive rights to publish the story. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Piece by piece, donation by donation, the funds trickled in. The world still doubted him, but now he had what he needed to begin. With determination burning in their hearts, the crew began to build the Kon-Tiki, a raft made not in a factory, but with their own hands, using ancient techniques passed down through time. There were no nails, no bolts, no modern tools. Just balsa with logs, hemp ropes, and faith in history. Every plank, every knot, every detail had to mirror what ancient South Americans might have used 1,000 years ago. After months of tireless preparation, the raft was finally ready. On the morning of April 28, 1947, from the port city of Callao, Peru, 6 men stepped aboard the Kon-Tiki. The sea lay before them like a vast question mark. No engines, no rescue. Just a wooden raft, the wind, and their will to prove the impossible. As the Kon-Tiki drifted away from the coast of Peru into the open embrace of the Pacific, the sense of adventure quickly gave way to the harsh reality of the ocean's unforgiving power. There was no land in sight, only an endless expanse of blue stretching in every direction, as if they were floating on the edge of the world. The Pacific didn't greet them gently. During the day, the sun beat down like fire, scorching their skin and turning the wooden deck into a blistering furnace. The crew wore minimal protection, and soon their backs were raw, peeling under the relentless heat. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the searing heat gave way to a biting cold that sank into their bones. There were no blankets thick enough, no shelters warm enough to keep them from shivering through the night. Every hour on that raft was a test of endurance. Their drinking water, carefully rationed from the start, began to run dangerously low. They stared at the sky, praying for rain. But the skies remained dry for days, taunting them with bright clouds that drifted past without offering relief. Each morning, they checked their empty cans with growing desperation. Their food stores, mostly dried biscuits and fruits, quickly dwindled, hunger gnawed at their stomachs. They turned to the ocean for sustenance, casting lines and nets in hopes of catching fish. At first, the results were disappointing. The vast Pacific, so full of life, felt barren. Sometimes they caught nothing for days. Other times, only small fish, barely enough to feed one man. Yet they ate whatever they could, often raw, soul still clinging to the flesh. Over time, their diet became almost entirely dependent on the sea. The fish were their only salvation, and even that came and went like luck on the wind. But hunger and thirst weren't their only enemies. The sheer size and silence of the ocean began to wear down their minds. Days blurred into nights, weeks passed without any sight of land. The stillness around them was maddening. The isolation, the rocking of the raft, the monotony of survival, it all began to chip away at their sanity. Some of the men started hallucinating, imagining shapes in the clouds, voices in the waves. Their bodies grew thin, their faces hollow. Even simple conversations became strained. The weight of the unknown, not knowing if they would ever reach land, or if they would simply disappear into the sea, pressed down on them like a heavy fog. And then came the shark. It was massive, dark, and menacing, circling the raft like a predator waiting for its prey to grow weaker. The men watched in terror as it edged closer and closer, its fins slicing the water beside their fragile logs. There was nothing to defend themselves with. They had no weapons, no power, only fear and faith. Just when it seemed the shark was about to strike, a giant whale appeared, its massive body breaching near the raft. The sudden splash sent waves rolling across the sea. The shark, startled or perhaps intimidated, vanished into the depths. The men stood in silence, staring into the water where the danger had once been. Was it a miracle, a lucky coincidence, or a sign that they weren't alone on this journey? No one knew for sure, but in that moment, something shifted. The crew, worn and weathered, began to believe again, not just in the mission, but in their survival. And through it all, Thor remained the anchor. He rarely showed fear. He charted the stars every night, checked the wind during the day, and believed, more than ever, that if ancient people had done this before, then so could they. The days had blurred into each other, salty, sun-scorched, and silent. For 101 grueling days, the Kon-Tiki had drifted across the heart of the Pacific Ocean, carrying 6 exhausted men on little more than logs, rope, and a fading dream. Their bodies were fragile now, sunburned, undernourished, their faces gaunt, and eyes sunken. But Thor Heyerdahl, despite the toll, never stopped watching the sky. Every morning, he stood at the edge of the raft, eyes scanning the horizon like a man searching for a promise, and then it came, a sign from above. A single bird, wings outstretched, circled gently overhead. Thor's heart leapt. This wasn't the vast, empty sky they had known for weeks. This bird was flying low, a messenger of land. Birds, especially coastal ones, never stray far from shore. He shouted to the crew, his voice raspy but alive with hope. And soon, there it was, a faint blue outline on the horizon. What began as a distant blur slowly sharpened into the unmistakable shape of land. They had done it against every odd, through every storm and nightmare. They had reached Polynesia. But the ocean was not done with them yet. As the raft drifted closer, the waters changed. Hidden beneath the surface lay a treacherous coral reef, sharp and unyielding. The waves pushed them forward, faster now as if impatient to end the journey. Thor's instincts screamed. He turned to the others and ordered them to abandon ship, to grab what they could and jump into the sea. Moments later, the mighty Kon-Tiki, which had carried them across a third of the globe, slammed into the reef. Wood splintered, the lashings tore, the raft was crushed in an instant, sacrificed at the finish line. The men paddled through the waves, arms barely moving, every stroke a fight against their own weakness. Salt water stung their eyes, their muscles screamed, but they kept going. Finally, they stumbled onto the sandy shore of Arroyo, part of the Tuamotu archipelago. They had made it not in triumph, but in pieces, worn, hungry, and victorious. Local islanders rushed to meet them, stunned by the sight. 6 foreign men, weathered like old sailors, washing ashore from the vast ocean on a handmade raft, with no engine, no compass, and no explanation, only a story that sounded impossible. But it was real. These weren't castaways. They were pioneers of proof. The villagers welcomed them, fed them, and celebrated them as if they had returned from the dead. Word spread quickly. Thor Heyerdahl had succeeded. He hadn't just survived the Pacific, he had conquered history itself. The Kon-Tiki may have been destroyed, but the idea it carried remained unbroken. Thor had shown the world that ancient South Americans could have reached Polynesia, not through fiction or fantasy, but through fearless reality. What began as a theory once laughed out of rooms had now landed, literally, on solid ground. And with it, Thor Heyerdahl didn't just reach an island, he rewrote the story of human possibility. Thor Heyerdahl didn't just return home, he returned as a legend. A man once mocked by experts was now greeted with applause, curiosity, and admiration from around the world. He had stared into the impossible and come back with proof. His story, once dismissed as foolish fantasy, now stood as a living testament to human courage and vision. He poured the soul of his journey into a book titled The Kon-Tiki Expedition, and it struck a chord far beyond the academic world. The book became an international bestseller, captivating millions with its tale of adventure, survival, and the pursuit of truth. It was eventually translated into over 70 languages, becoming one of the most widely read expedition accounts in history. But Thor didn't stop there. The voyage had been filmed in black and white, using a hand-cranked camera aboard the rocking raft. That raw footage was transformed into a gripping documentary, which went on to win the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1951. Suddenly, the man who had been called a madman was winning Oscars. Classrooms began discussing his theories. Universities took another look at ancient migration. He hadn't just sailed a raft, he had shifted the tide of historical thinking. Yet even after Kon-Tiki, Thor Heyerdahl's fire for exploration burned just as fiercely. He wasn't content with a single great voyage. In the years that followed, he continued to chase history across oceans. He built ships from Egyptian reed, recreating ancient vessels that could have sailed from Africa to the Americas. He designed Mesopotamian-style boats to test early trade routes between civilizations once thought isolated. Each journey was another question thrown at the past, and each one answered with sails full of wind and conviction. When Thor passed away in 2002, at the age of 87, he left behind more than films, books, or wrecked rafts. He left behind a message, a legacy carved not in stone, but in the hearts of dreamers and explorers everywhere. He had dared to ask what if, and then dared to find out. He reminded the world that the impossible only stays impossible until someone proves it otherwise. So when the world tells you that your idea is too crazy, your dream too far-fetched, or your vision too bold, remember. Thor Heyerdahl, remember the man who stared across 8,000 kilometers of ocean, pointed to the horizon, and said, "Let's prove it."